Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I'm Robert Baylor, Director of Communications at NUCA. Welcome to our latest webinar. First, before we begin, some webinar housekeeping. Today's webinar will be recorded. It will be available in the next few days on NUCA's YouTube channel, which can be accessed via nuca.com and at wedigamerica.org. Now about your WebEx Meetings webinar screen. There are two buttons on the lower right-hand side of your screen titled Participants and Chat. Clicking on Participants gives you a list of webinar attendees. You can chat amongst each other, or you can send the host questions or messages. All participants are muted upon entry. Phone participants can use *6 to mute themselves. Questions will be asked at the end of the webinar. To ask a question, you can submit a written question at any time using the chat feature, and I will read those written questions to our presenters at the conclusion of this presentation. Now let's get started. First, thank you for your time today, and thank you for participating in this year's summit. We are going to hear from NUCA's own lobbying staff in a minute to update you on the status of the critical infrastructure legislation moving through Congress this month. Today's briefing will help you understand the current situation behind several NUCA legislative priorities and how your participation in the summit will help advocate for their passage. I am joined today by our lobbying team, Evan Wyman and Zach Perconti. They need your help at the summit to get our industry's goals across to lawmakers. Sharing your experience on your state and local infrastructure projects and future demands will help lawmakers understand the need for additional federal resources in water, wastewater, broadband, highway, electric, and other industry areas. Thanks again for joining us today. Zach, I turn the webinar over to you.
Thank you, Bob, and good afternoon, everyone. If I can get the first slide up, please. So everyone, thank you for taking the time to join us today. We decided to do the issue briefing webinar a week in advance this year to go over stuff in a little more depth and to give us a little more time to discuss everything that's going on this summer. This is the perfect time to be holding Summit. We are moving into a summer that is going to be focused heavily on infrastructure legislation. And frankly, we have the potential to see more beneficial legislation passed for our industry than we have in a very long time. That being said, there are still a few areas of concern that we need to address when we're talking about things like labor policy and some of the tax policy that we need to push back on and make sure that when the administration is crafting its infrastructure policy, it's a beneficial one that's going to work to rebuild America and serve that goal as best it can. So in this, we're going to talk about our three top line issues for Summit this year. Those are water infrastructure investment, surface transportation reauthorization, and broadband. And then I'm also going to get into a little bit about some related issues, like I mentioned, labor, workforce development, tax policy, and a few other miscellaneous things. Next slide, please. So the first thing I want to talk about is kind of the main top line thing that we're really taking up a lot of the oxygen in Washington right now, and that is the Biden infrastructure plan. That plan comes in two pieces: the American Jobs Plan and the American Family Plan. The first one of those is the one I really want to focus on. The second part of the proposal pertains to a lot more with regards to things like higher education, some healthcare stuff. It's not really pertinent to our industry, but the two packages together do make up about $3 trillion in spending. So we're talking about sizable government investment right now. The first of those, the American Jobs Plan, is about a $2 trillion proposal. Now, that proposal includes significant funding for infrastructure and our industry priorities. $621 billion for surface transportation, $111 billion for water, an amount which frankly would be transformational and at many orders of magnitude more than we've seen coming from the government in a very long time. It would also include $200 billion for broadband and power infrastructure, divided evenly about right down the middle. In addition to that, there are some other proposals in there that do pertain to our industry. There's about $100 billion allocated for workforce development programs. Some of that money goes to colleges and universities, some of it goes to trade schools, some of it goes to grant programs. There's $300 billion towards bolstering American manufacturing. Of that, one thing I do want to note, there's $50 billion specifically allocated towards shoring up American semiconductor capacity. That's been a real issue that's been affecting a lot of different industries. Since the pandemic hit, there's been a major chip shortage, as I'm sure many of you know. And the administration wants to make sure that doesn't happen again and gives the industry all the tools it needs to maintain production levels. And in addition to that, kind of going a little bit hand in hand, there's $180 billion allocated for a variety of different research and development projects. There are also a lot of things in there that are not really considered traditional infrastructure. There's $400 billion for elder and community care, for example. Those primarily, in addition to some of the tax changes, do form the nucleus of Republican opposition to the American Jobs Plan. And so they've come back with a counteroffer that the administration has been considering. And that's about 800 billion now. It was 600, so it's come up substantially. And that's focused on traditional infrastructure. So roads, bridges, water infrastructure, broadband, some energy policy changes in there. So negotiations are ongoing, and we'll get to that towards the end of the webinar. One thing I do want to mention about this that's very important when we're talking about the American Jobs Plan, as of now, no legislative vehicle currently exists. If we're talking about do you support or oppose the Biden plan, that's not a specific piece of legislation just yet. House Democrats are likely to use H.R. 2, which we talked a lot about last year, as the framework for large parts of the president's plan, and we may see stuff starting to be introduced regarding that as early as next week. But as of now, there is no specific bill out there. One thing we are going to get into a little bit that is also now being worked into the infrastructure plan, cybersecurity. Since the Colonial Pipeline hack a couple of weeks ago that shut down a source of 45% of the fuel to the eastern seaboard, protecting critical infrastructure has kind of come to the forefront of a lot of folks' minds in Congress. And we're expecting that there's a good chance that you may get questions from members of Congress about what you and your companies and your customers are doing to protect critical infrastructure assets against cyber attack. Evan, do you have anything to add?
I do, as a matter of fact, and you're hitting all the right points, Zach, but I will say that the Colonial Pipeline hack has underscored the need for cybersecurity, and it's not just going to be about pipeline. Obviously, cybersecurity for the electric grid, and pretty soon it's going to be about broadband infrastructure as well, will be at the forefront. And what happened recently with Colonial, it has just put that on a more front shelf, if you will. So yeah, you probably will, and as experts in the construction industry, you might get asked questions about cybersecurity and your thoughts on that. So just kind of a heads up. So it's a good point you bring up, Zach.
Excellent point. Thanks, Evan. Can we get the next slide, please? So diving right into it, water infrastructure is probably if you only are going to talk about one thing in your meeting, water infrastructure right now is our area of most potential. And I'll get into that why a little more in a moment. But one of the things I want to leave everyone with are, I just want to give you a few talking points that you can refer to in your meetings. If you'll recall from last week's webinar and the week before that, when we talked a little bit about what you can do in these meetings, remember, you don't need to go in there and just talk legislation the whole time. One of the things we want to give you are talking points you can refer to emphasize why these issues are important. So when it comes to water infrastructure, there are some numbers on there. I'm not going to read everything there. All these are in your handouts as well. But 2 points that we want to hit very strongly. Number one, we've got $500 billion in needs across America's water infrastructure, and that number grows every year. Two, for every $1 billion invested in water infrastructure, an estimate of up to 28,000 jobs are created. Now that's our number. Some of the other groups in the industry have a lower number. They use 23,000. So you'll hear a variety of different numbers somewhere in that range cited. But our point is this is one of the best industries that Congress can invest in order to create real job growth. And more than one half of the jobs that are created are in industries other than ours. So the whole economy benefits. This isn't just us being self-serving when we advocate for this investment. This is really spreading that around across all of the American economy. Next slide, please.
Hey, Zach?
Yes.
This is Tom Butler. Can you go back to that slide real quick?
Yeah, absolutely.
And the only reason I want to say this is because the exempt facility bonds being on there also. Are we still seeing good traction on that?
Yep, and I'm actually going to get into that in just a moment.
Okay, cool. I'll shut up then.
No worries, Sam. Always welcome to jump in, Mr. Chairman. Next, for those of you who aren't aware, who might be joining us now, Tom Butler is the chairman of our Government Affairs Committee. So there is a major focus right now on water infrastructure legislation in Congress. We have three major bills that we want to talk about while we're at Summit. The first one is the one that NUCA has been pushing for months now. This is the bill that if you were present with us at convention, you recall that we talked about. The Water Quality Protection and Job Creation Act of 2021, or HR 1915. That bill provides $40 billion over 5 years for the Clean Water SRF and $10 billion in grants on top of that. We've been involved in the process of drafting and moving that legislation through since it was introduced, even before it was introduced. And it's very similar to funding provisions that were contained last year in HR 2. Now, a couple of days ago, Republicans introduced their counteroffer in the House, the Wastewater Infrastructure Improvement Act of 2021. That is a $14 billion over 5-year bill, but it is similar to the Senate bill. That is also supported by us. Now, we support the funding levels in the Democratic bill more, and you may get asked that. But what we are very encouraged by is the fact that Republicans are offering this counteroffer. They're willing to talk about this, and this is similar to a level that, frankly, we had a hard time getting them to accept in the last Congress. So the Republicans have come up tremendously from their initial offers. They're willing to negotiate, and we're seeing really a great dialogue starting on the Hill. Both of these bills would reauthorize the Clean Water SRF for the first time since 1994. So our bottom line, when you're being asked about these two bills, and the line that I encourage you to use, is that NUCA wants to see a bipartisan state revolving fund reauthorization accomplished at the highest possible level. Evan, do you have anything to add to that?
Nope. I would just say from a 50,000 foot level, I've been around this issue for about 20 years, and I've never seen a bipartisan bill, especially on the Republican side, that is endorsing these type of SRF levels, both on the wastewater and the drinking water side. So this really needs to be our focus next week. So I've been kind of blown away by even some on the Senate side, the bill that recently passed, even if that is considered the floor right now, if that passed tomorrow, that would be a huge increase in water and wastewater infrastructure funding for the industry and for America.
Thanks, Evan. And that is I couldn't ask for a better segue. Can I get the next slide, please? So just one more thing that I do want to mention. The House also does have a major drinking water bill. The Lift America Act has $51.6 billion in drinking water funding, including significant funding for lead pipe replacement. There is also broadband funding in that bill. We'll get to that in a moment. I do want to point out one thing about that bill. We're only specifically supporting the drinking water and the broadband funding provisions. There's a whole lot of stuff in there that we don't necessarily want to take a position on. There's some stuff in there we don't necessarily like as much, but we are strongly backing those specific provisions when Congress looks towards drafting a broader infrastructure package. Republicans also have a drinking water bill. If I'm being honest, they haven't really engaged much with us on that like they have on the clean water side. So we're just not really going to get into it when it comes to Summit. What Evan mentioned a moment ago is something that I really do want to trumpet because it is a huge win for us at NUCA, and that is Senate Bill 914, the Drinking Water and Wastewater Infrastructure Act of 2021. This is another bill that we've been involved in supporting from the get-go. It was introduced and moved through committee very swiftly, only in the space of a couple of weeks, passed through committee unanimously, was brought to the Senate floor as a bill that would provide $35 billion over 5 years, split about equally between the clean water and drinking water state revolving funds. Again, it includes significant funding specifically allocated for lead pipe replacement programs. The bill passed the Senate on a bipartisan 89-2 vote. That is increasingly rare in Congress that we see a bill on a significant program like this moved through in such a bipartisan manner. It's a huge step forward in Congress. Again, we have not seen movement on this issue in decades. And we want to, one, make sure that we're taking credit for this a little bit because we have been involved, but two, one of our asks for you at Summit is to thank your senators for their vote and support on this issue. It's a huge step. We love that it's bipartisan. We do support higher funding levels, but this is a critical step in the right direction. The senators that did not vote are listed on this slide. Do just keep an eye on those and don't thank them if they didn't vote for it. The senators that are absent largely just weren't in Washington. That does happen. It doesn't necessarily mean they oppose it. If anyone is meeting with the offices of Senator Cruz, Republican of Texas, or Senator Lee, Republican of Utah, give them a bit of a hard time. Senator Lee has explained why he voted against this bill. It had to pertain to issues of water rights and federal oversight of those. Senator Cruz has not yet said why he opposed this bill. And that's very disappointing for us. So, don't be afraid to give them a hard time and press them a little about why they voted the way they did. One last thing that I do want to mention, and this is what our Government Affairs Chairman, Tom Butler, brought up a moment ago. We're continuing our advocacy for exempt facility bonds. And I'm going to let Eben speak on that in a moment. But before I do, I just want to mention we're not entirely sure just yet where the Ways and Means folks are on that. We have been trying to get an answer out of them for a while on that, and so have, frankly, our friends in the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. But increasingly, there are conversations going on in Washington about other ways to make up some of the funding levels that we're seeing for the infrastructure package, things like Build America bonds, an infrastructure bank. And so these exempt facility bonds are still in the conversation, and they definitely are still something we're strongly supporting. Eben, you want to add to that?
Yep, thank you, Zach. And I would say that, yeah, the Ways and Means folks are keeping their infrastructure asks pretty close to the vest so far. One thing I do want to point out, this, as Zach has said, the EFVs, formerly PABs, and this would basically lift the state volume cap on existing bonds that would, if we lifted the cap, we would just unleash unlimited private sector money and an interested private sector that wants to invest in this infrastructure because they know that these projects will not default. But if we get this done, it's going to be a big deal. And before I get into where we are on it, if we get, I think it's safe to say that we're not going to get $100 billion in water and wastewater infrastructure, public money coming our way. But if we got 40, 50 billion and the EFVs, that would be a heck of a lot better than where we are right now. I would say that EFVs, when you talk to folks, because in the past, those of you that have been around this issue for a while, realize that in the past, Republicans liked the private activity bonds because they didn't have to support public spending on this infrastructure. The HR 2 was put together by Speaker Pelosi and mostly by Democratic co-sponsors. And they had this language in there. So when you talk to your delegation, let them know that this is no longer a Republican issue. This is a very bipartisan issue. And who can say exactly how much money is going to come our way in this infrastructure? But EFVs plus significant increases in SRF money will put us in a much better situation. So I just want to Zach, just want to underscore that this is no longer a Republican issue. This is a bipartisan issue, and Pelosi put it in her bill, which is a very big step in the right direction.
That's absolutely right. We're definitely starting to see some movement on this, and for what it's worth, I have spoken with Republicans on this recently, and they still support the idea of it. So if we continue to emphasize that this is a bipartisan concept, we're going to continue to push this movement in the right direction, and we might be able to get it across the finish line this year.
Exactly. One last thing on that, and we can probably put out and let the membership know Ways and Means members, so that if folks are meeting with Ways and Means members, that we'd like to see this EFE provision in their asks from that committee in an infrastructure package.
We can certainly circulate a list of those folks to everyone. Next slide, please. So we want to switch gears right now to talk about surface transportation. And the reason for that is the deadline for reauthorization is fast approaching. Last year, we only kicked the can down the road on the FAST Act, the bill that funds America's surface transportation infrastructure, 1 year. There had been a lot of hope that they'd be able to come to a long-term deal. They weren't able to do it, so they just reauthorized at existing levels and moved it to this year. We want to avoid that happening this year, and frankly, so do the folks in Congress. There is an estimated $786 billion backlog of road and bridge capital needs. That includes all sorts of stuff within that. And the Highway Trust Fund continues to remain underfunded. We're looking at a $94 billion shortfall over the next 5 years. In addition to that, there is a growing concern around the fact that the gas tax has not been raised in years, and electric vehicles are every year taking up a larger share of the cars that are on the road. So a solution to finding the funding of the Highway Trust Fund, again, still remains something that we advocate for. Next slide, please. So
Hey,
just
Zach, Tom Butler again. I want to suggest one thing that we add to that slide is a photo of the bridge in Tennessee, I-40 bridge over the Mississippi River that has a crack in it that they're having to do an emergency repair on. Did you guys see that?
that is an excellent thing. If folks haven't seen that, you should take a look. It is striking.
Yeah, this
Yeah.
is Natalie.
We need to add a picture of that. I think it was Memphis, but yeah, Memphis or Nashville, whatever.
It is Memphis. Yes, it is Memphis.
Yeah.
And
Tom,
the
I mean,
additional
we need to add a
point
picture
to
of that.
the additional point to that is river traffic has been stopped in that area now.
And we should,
Yeah,
and
I just think
absolutely,
we
we're going to
add
want to, if someone wants to put a photo of that in the chat, just a link to a news article or something around it, I do encourage folks to take a look at it. It is a very striking example of just how dangerous this problem can be if we continue to neglect our nation's surface transportation infrastructure. I mean, it's the sort of thing that, if you're a member of Congress or their staff are unaware of it, especially for folks that do any sort of work around those types of projects, I encourage you to direct them to that. It is pretty much one of the best examples of the catastrophic nature of a lot of our infrastructure right now, and what neglect does to that.
And Zach, it's a very timely example and one that's making the news, but it's certainly not, limited to just a couple of bridges. I mean, that problem is across the country and has been for a long
Absolutely.
time.
So to talk a little bit about where we are legislatively, again, I said we're coming off of a 1-year FAST Act extension. The deadline for reauthorization is September 30th. One of the reasons I do want to draw our attention to this, and this is a great thing that you can help connect back to your districts and your states, earmarks are back in limited form. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. I'm one of the people that actually does see the value in them from a legislative perspective. They are used to help broker deals, but they also help draw attention to projects that need a little extra funding at the federal level and aren't necessarily as politically attractive or high profile as others. The example I always like to give is replacing the roof and the pipes in an elementary school. There are a sizable number of changes that have been done around the earmarks process right now. In particular, the guidelines sort of from 10,000 feet up are the projects must demonstrate importance, local backing, and some sort of matching state and local funds. Now they've been capped at 15 billion, which is a very small percentage of the final bill, but so far about 2,300 requests have been submitted across both parties, with nearly about 3/4 of Congress submitting requests. If there is something that is particularly important in your district, do feel free to let them know. But that's just something I do want to draw attention to in case you get any questions about it. Now, when it comes to the actual legislation itself, this webinar is very timely. We do actually have some news from this morning. Today, Republicans in the House T&I Committee introduced their proposal, the Starter Act. The Starter Act is about a $400 billion package. It contains funding for most of the same things that we traditionally see in there: roads, bridges. It does not contain funding for passenger rail, which is a notable omission. We're expecting the the Democratic counteroffer, or Democratic offer rather, to be introduced some point next week. It could be a little later than that. The date that we do want to put in everyone's minds is June 9th. That is when we're likely to see a big markup. So you will get asked about this sort of stuff. And just let folks know the projects you work on that go into surface transportation projects. There's obviously a lot of utility relocation and all sorts of other things that go into these projects. And just inform them of the role that you and your business play in these projects as they craft this major spending bill. Evan, do you have anything to add to this?
No, you just hit it right on the head. I wanted to make sure everyone realized, or just accentuate the need to talk about utility relocation. I mean, a lot of folks out there and some of the quote environmentalists that might not vote for a highway bill because they think it's all about roads and bridges. Let them know that there's a lot of utility relocation, stormwater, underground water mains. I mean, there's a lot of work in there that it's not just creating jobs, but enhancing environmental protection through surface transportation. So speak to what you know. I just want to remind folks of that.
Next slide, please. So the last of the three things that we have fact sheets specifically on this year is broadband. And the reason that we've chosen this as one of the three fact sheet issues is there is a tremendous emphasis on broadband expansion and investment in Congress in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. In particular, we're looking at a lot of folks that are urging great federal investment to target rural areas, unserved areas, and underserved areas. Only 22% of 19 million Americans still lack access to fixed broadband speeds at even basic thresholds. And in rural areas, 22% of Americans lack even 25/3 home internet service, which is way obsolete right now. I'm going to turn it over to Eben to talk a little bit more about the importance of raising those speed thresholds and also how we can accomplish that.
Thank you, Zach. And yeah, so the pandemic has underscored the need. I mean, broadband infrastructure and a higher level of service has been a priority for the past couple of years anyway. The pandemic has underscored that. High-speed broadband is no longer a luxury. It's a necessity. In the past 14 months have really shown that. We know that we're going to look at upwards of $100 billion coming our way in terms of broadband infrastructure. We just want to make sure that the money is spent right. And what I'm getting at there is there was a recent FCC auction that was about a little over $9 billion, where SpaceX and Elon Musk and some of the wireless service providers that don't really have any demonstrated track record of success got upwards of $1 billion in RDOF, in funding from the FCC, without being able to show that they can deliver. So when you talk about broadband, and we'll look at the Clyburn bill in a second, but we know the money's coming. Let's just make sure that the criteria for securing that money is such that is the best way to spend the taxpayer buck. Next slide, if you will. So Jim Clyburn, who's the House Majority Whip, introduced the Accessible Affordable Internet for All Act. It's $94 billion. It does have a higher speed threshold. And I think, just not getting inside baseball on you too much, I think, and industry thinks, that if we have 100 up, 100 down broadband speed as the threshold for securing money, that will future-proof it, so that in the future, it will come down to the device and not the underground or overhead infrastructure to provide that service. We've got that right now. I think we've made a lot of progress to secure that. There is pushback by the wireless industry. I would say that one thing we've gotten a lot of progress on is that wireless isn't really, you don't get wireless without wires. If you want to have effective broadband, you've got to have fiber optic, at least right now. So satellites and some of these other wireless technologies is not the way to go at this time. So we really need to push not just the money, but but policy and speed thresholds that require the infrastructure to provide that service. Anything to add, Zach, on that?
No, I think that about covers it. I mean, the definition that's been brought forward on those speed standards is something that we do want to emphasize because it does encourage the sort of work that we do with regards to fiber layout and deployment. One thing I do want to point out that's very significant is that the current definition for service is 25.3, as the FCC puts it. This bill would define unserved areas, areas that don't have broadband service at all, as areas that have below 25 up, which would cover a significant amount of areas. So this would go a long way in expanding access to high-speed internet across the country.
Yeah, I think that's right. But just keep in mind, for folks that are, aren't inside the game on this, for next week, we just want to make the case that we want speed thresholds that will ensure broadband service when we need it most. And having unproven technologies out there and giving them a lot of money, I think the best way I've heard it put is if Elon Musk wants to do his R&D, let him do it on his own dime and not the taxpayer dime. So until these folks can prove that they can deliver, they shouldn't be getting billions of dollars in taxpayer money. Now, as your lobbyist, Zach and I think we're right on this. It's fiber optic means a lot of work for NUCA members, but I think the truth is on our side on this. So I think that should be a talking point when you're talking about broadband is let's make sure we have the infrastructure to do that. And that is fiber optic.
Absolutely right. Next slide, please. So now I do want to get into a few of the other issues. And I've noticed a few questions popping up in the chat. I will get to everything when we're through these. So just keep that in mind. So to talk briefly about tax policy, we've talked a lot about federal investment. The question does come up, well, how are we going to pay for this? That is one of the things that has kind of delayed the rollout of the legislation that we've talked about that has been proposed by the Biden administration. They're trying to figure out a way to get to these high numbers. And one of the common proposals we've seen is a proposed increase in the corporate tax rate. The current rate, 21%, if you'll recall, that was lowered as a result of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. The Biden plan would increase that to 28%. In addition to that, there's a proposed global minimum corporate tax of 21% on U.S. companies to deter companies from sheltering profits overseas, as the administration would put it. There's also a 15% minimum tax being proposed on large corporation book income reported to investors. NUCA has taken a line that we do oppose this proposed increase in the corporate tax rate. That's essentially the same line that is being shared by pretty much all industry stakeholders with regards to this. One other thing I do want to note, because it does play into the political considerations, the Biden plan does call for significant additional investment in the IRS to increase enforcement and compliance. There is a question with regards to that as to how that would be scored for purposes of reconciliation and budget, which would potentially let them increase the size of the package. Under current rules, money that they invest in the IRS does count as an expense, but they believe they have the data to show that that investment would yield significant revenue windfalls for the U.S. government. And so if they're successful in making that argument, they may actually be able to count that as an offset and use that to increase or at least pay for a part of the broader package. Evan, anything to add on the tax rate?
No, I just would say that this should be considered a peripheral issue. We should keep our eye on the prize, seeing where we are on water infrastructure. That should be the main focus. If anything, we talk about the corporate taxes, we should say that it's not a good way to pay for infrastructure because it's never going to, it's not going to work. But I think that the focus really needs to be on water, surface transfo, and broadband.
That's right. Next slide, please. So this is an area that is going to come up a lot. This does tie directly into everything we've discussed. We don't have a fact sheet specifically on it, but it kind of ties into everything that we're doing. And that is labor. There have been a broad push for pro-union policies from Biden and congressional Democrats. Now, I know NUCA's membership is split, but we've still largely taken a stance that we do oppose a lot of these changes because many of them would adversely affect the business of our union members as well. One of the issues that's been discussed, and I'll let Evan speak a little more on the PRO Act specifically, we've talked about it to you all before. It is included as a proposal in the Biden infrastructure plan. HR 842, the House version, passed the House along party lines. The Senate version is awaiting the floor and is facing a guaranteed filibuster from Senate Republicans. We don't want to spend too much time talking about it because unless the filibuster changes, the bill is not going anywhere, but it is a concern, and we are concerned about pieces of the bill potentially being incorporated into larger packages. Another thing I do want to get into, and again, I'll let Evan speak to this a little more in detail, are government mandated project labor agreements. We've seen pro-PLA language frequently inserted in Democratic bills. A lot of stuff out of the House Energy and Commerce Committee has had that language in there in particular. There are bills that NUCA are supporting that some of our Republican allies on the Hill have introduced, the Fair and Open Competition Act. We've sent out some grassroots messages around this before. Again, it is something that we do want to mention as something that we support, but a lot of these this project labor agreement language can't really be included in something that is subject to the filibuster. So Evan, go ahead.
No, I think that's right, Zach. I think you got it. I would say if you get asked next week about water infrastructure legislation and they bring up something like Davis-Bacon, it's no longer really an issue because that was enacted through the appropriations process several years ago. So Davis-Bacon is kind of already out there in terms of SRF projects. PLAs is something different. If they try to push PLAs, what you're doing when you're talking about union only is you're cutting out the majority of the workforce at a time when, you guys would tell me before I tell you, one of the biggest challenges we face is having enough qualified folks to do this type of work. And so whenever they talk about project labor agreements, anything they're doing to cut out non-union labor is only going to hurt the infrastructure. And that's not just water, that's surface transpo, and certainly broadband. So I would think any utility construction would be impacted by this, and exacerbate a problem that is already a leading challenge to our industry. So just without getting into too much on because I think the PRO Act, I think you're right. It's not going to go anywhere unless they mess with the filibuster. PLAs should be something you guys should talk about. Because again, Davis-Bacon's already, quote, taken care of. PLAs is something that if that is mandated, it's going to take a lot of folks out of the equation at a time when we need all the workers we can get.
And that is a
Yeah,
perfect segue. I couldn't ask for a better way
Zach,
to workforce. Go ahead, Tom.
Tommy, and I just want to say that, for that with the PLAs is, I think a simple way to put it is that, hey, if you are going to spend taxpayer money, taxpayer-owned companies ought to be capable of winning that work, regardless of whether they're unionized or not.
Great point, Chairman.
Good point.
Great point.
And that is also an excellent segue into the last bullet on here, workforce development. I don't need to tell anybody on this call about the workforce shortages facing our industry. Everybody here knows it much better than I do and much better than the folks on the Hill. That is something that we do want to cite as a concern around these PLAs. The industry is already facing a shortage of workers. Talk with your members of Congress and their staff about the shortages that you, your companies, your customers are facing. Let them know that we do want to see federal activity in promoting workforce development programs. There have been apprenticeship program support bills that have been introduced in the past in Congress, including in this Congress. One of the concerns we have had with some of them is they do tend to favor union employers over non-union. And again, NUCA has a split membership, but we also are concerned about locking out a large segment of the industry at a time when we need every skilled laborer that we can get. If you have other specific concerns or ideas around workforce development programs, feel free to share those with us and with your members of Congress. It's a growing issue. If they manage to pass a large sweeping infrastructure bill like we're hoping they will, that will likely be one of our next major areas of focus because Congress will quickly realize that there aren't enough bodies to do a lot of this work. So that is something that we want to address, and just keep that in mind when you're having these conversations. Evan, do you have anything to add before we go to the next slide?
No, I think you covered it very well there, Zach.
All right. So I want to talk briefly about some other issues. First thing I want to cover, we talked about cybersecurity at the beginning. Just do keep that in the back of your mind. We do support legislative efforts to harden our nation's digital infrastructure in order to protect our nation's physical infrastructure. That's kind of the line that I like to use. Just keep that in the back of your minds, especially if your member of Congress asks about it. Now, I did see a question pop up in the chat about, are we going to discuss gas issues? The reason we did not include gas this year as one of our 3 top line issues is we did have the pipeline safety bill pass in the last Congress. That was one of the big successes of the lame duck session. They were able to get that through and reauthorized. However, I am going to turn it over to Eben real quick just to talk about a couple things you guys can be aware of that's going on there, just in case you do get asked about it by your member of Congress, or if you're heavily involved in that business, if you do want to speak on it.
No, it's a great point, Zach. And I would say that the reason we're not going to make this a federal issue next week is because the big fight on gas and gas distribution is really going on. And frankly, the use of natural gas and the future of natural gas is going on. That fight is at the state level right now. We have about 20 states that are trying to enact or have enacted harmful legislation that would mandate electrification and even phase out natural gas over the course of 10 or 20 years. At the same time, we have another 20 states that are enacting legislation that would prohibit those type of laws being enacted. So it's not, I mean, if you do gas distribution, you might bring up the fact in passing that a couple of things. If we're going to have net zero methane emissions or greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, you're not going to get there without natural gas. And if you want to increase the use of hydrogen or what they call carbon capture, where you capture carbon dioxide and move it to where you can use it in an industry or safely store it, you're not going to do that without pipelines. So the reason we didn't put this in the top 3 is because right now it's a state issue. I think, Zach, we're putting stuff out on how NUCA members can be involved in that state battle, but certainly you can talk about it if you'd like to, but we didn't put it in the top 3 because it's not really a federal issue right now.
Absolutely. I think that's a good way of putting it. And if you are more interested in learning about those issues, you can always feel free to contact either one of us. One thing I do want to add, particularly for folks who are involved in gas distribution main replacements, there is always pops up among especially a lot of Democrats, the idea of accelerating the replacement of old gas lines to combat methane emissions. That is something that may come up. Your industry experts, you can speak to how that work goes, what goes into that. One thing that we frequently hear from you all is that part of the issue, frankly, is a workforce issue there as well. We've had proposals in the past that NUCA has been involved in where members of Congress have tried to accelerate the timetable for replacing old gas lines. And one of the things we tell them is it's very difficult to move that timeline up while still maintaining workplace safety due to, frankly, the worker shortages that are facing us. Eben, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say, you put it lightly. I think a lot of NUCA members that do gas distribution would say we're simply not going to accelerate this stuff because we will be putting our workers at risk. And that was what we said during the pipeline safety bill last year. And that's why we got that, and this was in the wake of Merrimack Valley in Massachusetts, where Elizabeth Warren and Ed Markey said, well, we need to accelerate the removal of cast iron pipe and put in, the plastic stuff. And our guys said, look, we're just simply not going to do that because you're not going to stretch a work crew, from 8 guys to 4 guys each and put people at risk. And we were successful at that. So if you are asked about it, that's the reason why, we're not going to support language like that. And by the way, we're pulling out so much cast iron and putting in that polyethylene. They're going gangbusters on DOT requirements to assess the risk of their systems for the industry and to get contractors to do that work. We're already going as hard as we can.
And one last thing I do want to mention to folks before we move on to open the floor to questions. If you're in a meeting with a member of Congress or their staff and you get asked a question you don't know the answer to, that is what Eben and I are here for. Shoot us a note, tell them you'll get back to them. and let us know, and we'll answer it to the best of our ability. A big part of the importance of Washington Summit is building these relationships with your member of Congress and their staff. And, being able to follow up like that is frankly a blessing in disguise. Even if you might not know the answer during the meeting, it gives you a perfect opportunity to keep that conversation moving forward. And so, if the conversation does flow into an area where you don't have an answer right away, take advantage of that and bring us into the conversation. And we're more than happy to help however we can. On that note, I'm going to turn it back over to Bob for the end and open for the question. Yes, Evan.
Zach, let me add one thing to that. Just remember, when you're talking to folks in your state, what they want to hear about are the projects you're working on there, the people that you employ there, and hit them in their backyard. That's the best part about a NUCA summit, a Washington Summit, is the fact that we've got constituents and, importantly, employers in these districts and states talking to congressional offices. You don't have to be a policy wonk like me and Zach. Talk to speak to what you know, because that's what they want to hear. And Zach's exactly right. Any questions that you can't answer, send them to us, because we will, and we'll follow up, because it always is a good way to put a name with the face of their constituents. Zach and I represent you, and we connect the dots from there. So speak locally.
Absolutely right. All right, Bob, take it away.
Thank you, too.
Actually, I'm sorry. I forgot I had this.
Look at you jumping ahead. I will wait.
So we do have some summit prep resources I do want to speak on really quickly. In particular, WeDigAmerica.org, the official 2021 summit website. You'll be able to find most everything there. You'll see issue fact sheets. Those are what I drew those graphics from earlier. 2-page explanations. The primary thing you're going to point your congressional staff to. You'll also be able to use those as resources for yourself and your preparation. In addition to that, over the next coming days, you will see a comprehensive issue background document as we had last year posted. Those are going to be a collection of letters, testimony, all sorts of things that NUCA has signed on to and prepared around these issues over the past few months. Those are optional. They're long documents, but they are worth if you do want to do a little extra research. The primary useful thing for those is to be able to point members of Congress and their staff to give them a little more background on what we're doing. Bob did want me to point out in the chat, additionally, each PowerPoint presentation is available on the website as well as videos of each session. There are also a couple more resources that are going to be provided by NUCA staff. We're preparing cheat sheets on each individual member of Congress. Those are essentially going to be one-page at a glance bios, just bullet points, their photo, some information about them, what key legislation they've signed on to. Look for those in the coming days. No later than next Monday, you'll get your hands on them. That's not something we've done before, but we're hoping to be doing it going forward, and we hope that you find that a valuable resource for preparing for your meetings. Last but not least, you'll also be receiving a one-page list of talking points that we're going to try to organize by priority. So the first thing is going to be water infrastructure, then a little on surface, a little on broadband, and a little on our other issues. Do not feel like you need to talk about all 3 of our issues at Summit. Let the conversation go where it will and talk about what's important to you and your business. But we're making those available to you just as another way to help make these meetings go as smoothly as possible. With that, now I will turn it back over to Bob.
Thank you, Zach. And we have a few questions. Let's start at the top. Are these projects going to be shovel-ready only projects that will get funded?
Well, I guess I can take a crack at that. We're no longer allowed to say shovel ready after the disaster in the Recovery Act of 2009. So no, this will be, the SRF funding will go to the states through the program, through the formula that EPA uses to distribute SRF funding to the states. Every state has to have a project priority list or an intended use of plan of planned projects that need funding, and that's kind of how they come up with the estimations of state needs. So no, shovel ready is no longer in the equation.
That's absolutely right.
Thank you, Evan. Another question is, this is for the Senate. Let me see if I can phrase it correctly. What are your thoughts in terms of our summit attendees discussing subsurface utility engineering language? We just had a big summit in Pennsylvania on it. Should we end up discussing that? Should that be brought up as a potential avenue for a legislator to explore?
You want me to take that one, Zach?
It's certainly worth working into the conversation regarding surface transportation. You can talk about it and how it can affect state revolving fund projects. It's absolutely worth exploring. I'm not aware of any concrete legislative language right now that specifically covers Sioux, but it's, if it's something that you want to bring into the conversation, I don't see any reason why not to. Evan, you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I do. And I know this is Brenda because she's a true champion too. No, and she is. And I think, and Brenda, what we didn't get in the pipeline bill last year was Sioux language, and we didn't get that state enforcement of damage prevention law. And in an infrastructure package where all the conversation seems to be about funding levels, labor policy, and keeping some of the climate stuff out, it's probably not going to make it in an infrastructure package this year. I think in the damage prevention committee, we'll talk about this. We'll continue talking about this. I think at least for the next 4 years, the Sioux fight is going to be at the state level. And so I just don't see it making in an infrastructure package, because if we did it, we'd have to get the support of several other excavator groups that want to see it. And I've kind of pitched it to the AGC and other folks, and no one's biting, because they either want significant highway funding increases, water and infrastructure, broadband. I mean, the folks that are digging aren't looking at Sioux right now at a federal level.
And just to add a little more onto that, I think Evan's right in the sense that the conversation right now is really mainly focused on the funding levels. This is one of the tricky parts about there not being any concrete surface transportation language available for us to review just yet. The way that they're going around the package this year is, one, they're using last year's as a base, but two, they are kind of pulling language from a lot of these other large bills that we've talked about to make up the final infrastructure package. And so there's a little uncertainty right now over what's going to get included, but because we don't necessarily have something concrete to point to, it does make it a little harder to advocate for its inclusion in this specific bill. Now, does that mean the fight is over this? Absolutely not. But as Evan said, I think for now, our best avenue of success likely will be at the state level, at least to show immediate results.
Yeah, and Zach, through the muster program, we can do this at the state level. We can help out state by state. And I just think until the next pipeline safety bill comes up in a few years, I think it's going to be a state fight, a state level fight.
Yep. Brenda, we can always circle back and talk a little bit more about how we can incorporate more of this into our federal advocacy, but I think Evan's right. For now, given where the conversation seems to be going in Washington, I just don't feel super optimistic about it making it into this package.
Thank you, Zach. We have another question. This is more of a process question, given how we do these meetings virtually as opposed to in person. Question is, should we send our fact sheets to members of Congress before our meetings, or when would be the appropriate time to sort of give that leave behind information?
Evan, what do you think about that? I'm wondering if we're going to have the same answer.
I think if you send it to them up front, I think that's a great idea. If you can't do that, discuss it and send it after the fact. But yeah, I think if we can get it to them a day or two before, I think that's a great idea.
I would largely agree.
This is Tom. Hey, this is Tom. I would also recommend, and I've done this in the past, whoever is what you're doing, if you're talking from your computer in your office at home, whatever, have printouts of those papers and hold them up in front of your face and say, hey, this is the one I'm talking about now. See how it has the red on the top and it says this? Actually show them so that they can, because just to try and make it as easy as possible for them to be looking at the same thing you're looking at.
Another great point.
Great point. I agree with sending them up front, but I also like to recommend that you, especially if they have staffers that have joined the meeting that weren't on the first call, when you do send your follow-up email, go ahead and send them again. We do want to make sure that folks look at these if we can. There's a lot of good info on those, I know that we've all worked hard in putting those together, but it does convey a lot of our points pretty concisely. And so it's a good, resource, not only for you in presenting these meetings, but also for congressional staff to know where our organization stands on these. So if you want to send them twice, again, especially if other members of the staff join the call, there's no reason that you shouldn't do that.
Zach, you bring up a good point, because it's a great way to send that the second time is through a thank you note. And we can't accentuate enough the importance of a follow-up from just one of your group. For the folks that are on these virtual visits, send a thank you note just for their time. Remind them of what we talked about, and there's nothing wrong with attaching the one-pagers on the issues that we talked about.
Now, that does actually remind me of a request that I do have for folks here. When we're talking about following up on these meetings, if you've taken notes on your meetings, which I encourage you to do, we at Government Affairs always appreciate having those in front of us. We're going to be dropping in on meetings throughout the day, which is partially why we do encourage the executive directors to put their meetings up on the national spreadsheet. But we can't be in every meeting. If you give us and provide us with notes for what you talked about, we will go back and use those and refer to those as we continue to advocate for you all in Washington, D.C. So can't encourage you enough to take notes and follow and send those to us to follow up on them. A big part of Summit, as you all know, again, is building these relationships with your members of Congress and their staff, and just having us have those at our disposal to go back and refer to and say, hey, you met with Nebraska 3 weeks ago, and I see that they talked with you about X, Y, and Z. You talked with our folks in Pennsylvania about, such and such. Having us being able to go back and refer to that, it really does help strengthen the relationships that we're building with these offices.
Zach, along those lines, that's a good point. And it also helps with the influence. If you send us notes, we can remind them that NUCA member A talked to staffer A, we're their lobbyist, and it's not just the one pager, it's what was said, and what you write down to remind them. And then in the back of their mind, a smart staffer is going to think, all right, well, shoot, these guys talk to their lobbyists, and I better at least answer the question and address the request.
That's right.
And I'd like to remind everyone that all this information, the fact sheets, are up on WeDigAmerica.org under resources, and they'll be up there for a while. So there's no hurry we're not going to take it down or anything like that anytime soon. Everyone, we are up against the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. Edmund and Zach, thank you very much. And Tom, thank you very much for your time today to present this information to our guests. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the WeDigAmerica.org website, and our YouTube channel. We'll try to get up as soon as possible. And thank you for your time today to join us for this webinar and supporting NUCA. Next Wednesday is Washington Summit. The day is going to start at 9 o'clock a.m. Eastern with about a 35-minute opening session featuring top lawmakers discussing the status of our issues in the House and Senate. We'll also hear from NUCA Chairman Lauren Atwell on the events ahead that day. Your chapter is arranging your virtual meetings that will be held throughout the day, and we'll finish the day off at 5 p.m. Eastern with an online wrap-up of the experience. We hope you'll attend and share your own thoughts on the day. And we're glad you want to be part of the 2021 Washington Summit. Thank you for your time this afternoon, and please enjoy the rest of your week.